Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 69 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1 in overtime. So this is now the second straight game in which the Sharks have gone to overtime, the second straight game in which they have lost in overtime. However, the scores of both of these games are very, very different. Here tonight, it certainly appears to have been a very close game, 2-1 in overtime, while the previous one against the Blue Jackets was a 6-5 score. However, the major difference is not that nothing happened in this game while there were so many chances in the previous one. The major difference between those two games is honestly kind of the goaltending. Both Kakinen and Tarasov, from a Blue Jackets perspective, were not particularly great, or at least had some really awful moments in that game, which allowed the score to really get piled up. Here tonight, while the first period was rather slow and so it ended up being a 0-0 game after 20 minutes, the pace certainly picked up in those last 40 minutes, and yet both Grubauer and Reimer were playing very well and not really giving many chances to get either team on the board here. And so in the second period, while there were some high danger opportunities both ways, it was still a 0-0 game come the final frame. And that is when we saw Eklund with his second straight goal in 2 straight games here, and this one coming on a penalty shot, which is rather rare. There are players who will go an entire NHL career without getting even an attempt on a penalty shot. And so for Eklund's second career goal to have come in this situation is pretty special for him. And he manages to get the Sharks on the board, their first goal of this game, the first goal in general of this game, to make it 1-0. However, just a couple of minutes later, Bjorkstrand, in a breakaway of his own, though not in the penalty shot variety, would tie this game up at 1. And while there were chances definitely for either team, there was one even in just the last 20 seconds for the Seattle Kraken to be able to take the lead and give the Sharks a regulation loss, most likely. Instead, we would go to overtime. There were some zone time from a Sharks perspective, but they never really got a chance on net. Meanwhile, the Seattle Kraken would go the other way, and it would be Vince Dunn in this situation. Unfortunately, even though Reimer had played a very, very strong regulation 60 minutes, with only letting in that one goal to Bjorkstrand on the breakaway, he lets in a pretty weak one to Dunn here, and as such, the Sharks will give up that extra point, will only leave with just the 1. However, having said that, of course, if we take a look at the bottom of the standings, while I'm saying the Sharks only get 1, it's kind of a bad thing when you take a look at the Bedard sweepstakes. So we, of course, still have the Flyers leading the way in that 5th last spot, but they were not in action here tonight. There were only 3 teams in action here tonight on this list. The Sharks, of course, like I said, jumping up to 52 points. Coming into today, the Sharks had an opportunity to actually find themselves in last place in the league at the end of the day. If they had lost in regulation to Seattle and the Blue Jackets had won against the Los Angeles Kings, the Sharks would have actually been last, but neither of those things happened. The Sharks get the 1 point. Like I said, the Blue Jackets lose in regulation, so they stand pat at 49. This means that the Sharks are still 2 games away, at least, from being able to get that last place spot. The Blue Jackets retain their 2 games in hand, but it's hard to say that they'll be able to close that gap because the Blue Jackets are not very good, just as the Sharks are not very good, and so that is indeed the case. This would have tied the Sharks with the Chicago Blackhawks for that 3rd last spot, or that 2nd last spot, but the Blackhawks were once again victorious off the back of former San Jose Sharks goaltender Alex Stalock. They beat the Nashville Predators and they bumped themselves up to 4th last, or at least tied for it, with the Anaheim Ducks at 54 points. So the Sharks trying to create a bit of separation, but this overtime loss will hurt them slightly in that race to the bottom for sure. Now let us move on to the players to talk about. There were some changes to the lineup. Now, while all 12 forwards remained the same, there were no new faces, there was some line juggling that went down. We saw near the end of last game against the Columbus Blue Jackets, David Quinn decided to go with a new look-ish for the Sharks' top 6. They had Eklund and Hurdle joined by Kevin Labanc, while retaining the top line of Barabanov, Couture, and Johnson. But however, here tonight, it is further mixed up as Labanc and Eklund remain together as a duo, but are joined instead by center Logan Couture here, and then it is Hurdle who gets bumped up to the Barabanov-Johnson line. And there are some reasons for and against this. One of the things that I didn't necessarily like about this situation is that When it comes to the type of players that Eklund and Labanc are, I feel as though a player like Hurdle, who's maybe more able to create space in the offensive zone for his wingers, may have served better on that line compared to Logan Couture. But I can understand the logic for sure of what David Quinn is going for. Couture, the at least slightly more defensively responsible than Tomas Hurdle, and so maybe that could help shore up the potential defensive issues that this line may have otherwise had. However, another major problem with this, and this also extends to the Hurdle, Barabanov, Johnson line, is that you kind of mess up some of the chemistry that had been developing. Literally none of these players were actually together on a line before the game against the Columbus Blue Jackets. Eklund and Labanc got that third period, but not much else. Couture has not played with William Eklund, who has been mostly with Hurdle, and then Hurdle, while he and Barabanov go way back, they have been on lines before for an extended period of time. Recently, it has been Barabanov and Couture together for a while, and so it was kind of an awkward situation here, and you did sort of see that, at least with this line of Hurdle, Barabanov, and Johnson. While these players did have individually occasionally a nice play, Barabanov had a couple of good opportunities by himself, and same goes with Tomas Hurdle. Generally, as a cohesive line, there really wasn't much doing here. I definitely liked Hurdle a lot more when he was on that other line with Eklund. He had really been coming sort of creeping up in terms of play. Certainly not at the level that you might expect from Tomas Hurdle, but he was getting near to that, and it felt as though this was more of a step back game than yet another step forward for him. However, when it comes to the other line, Couture, Labanc, and Eklund, this line did have some decent chances for sure. Eklund doing some really solid things in the offensive zone at even strength, which was definitely nice to see. Labanc also having a pretty decent game for himself as well, and Couture definitely getting to benefit from playing with two faster, more skilled type of players on this line. So it was definitely an interesting one for sure. If there is one thing that I do want to mention about William Eklund, and this maybe pertains more so to the power play, and this is something that I wanted to mention in the previous game, but I didn't necessarily have the time to do so, is that you'll constantly hear coaches say, make the simple play, right? Sometimes, the simple play is the best play, is the obvious play, and you just go for that. But the best players in the league will be able to notice when there is a different play that they can make. Yes, in a situation, let's say on the power play, a very simple play is just to pass it back up to the point, relieve some pressure, let that player handle it. But certain players will look for those cross-ice passes, will look to keep the puck longer, and that's what separates them from, the good players to the great players. And we'll see Eklund, at times he'll make that simple play, and at times he'll try and make something happen, but he has been having slight issues on that power play, really evaluating when he can actually make something happen instead of just making that simple play. It feels as though pretty much at least once a game on a Sharks power play, Eklund will have the puck along the boards, and instead of just feeding it back to Erik Karlsson, he'll try and make some sort of solo effort play, and he'll end up losing the puck, and the puck will end up getting cleared out. So I like that he's trying to go for that. I don't think that needs to be scrubbed out of his game, but he does need to improve slightly, and this will come with time, of course, about when he has to indeed make that simple play and when he could try and take it a bit further. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, this was Gregor Sturm and Svechnikov. However, Svechnikov barely got to play in this game, ends up getting injured pretty early on, and so while there were no new faces in tonight's lineup, there likely will be in the next game's lineup. So Gregor and Sturm actually ended up getting joined by Zetterlund for much of the rest of this game on the third line, and I actually thought the third line there looked pretty good. In particular, Gregor and Sturm, I thought both showed up in pretty obvious ways. Gregor had a very classic Noah Gregor game. I had been praising him over the past couple of games for doing some really solid things. Here tonight was definitely more in Gregor's wheelhouse. I think he had like 3 or 4 really, not necessarily odd man rushes, but maybe like one-on-one type of chances where he came very, very close to scoring. There was the chance from a very nice Erik Karlsson pass right at the end of the first period, literally with like a second to go, where he ends up hitting the post, which could have put the Sharks up 1-0 in that situation. So I thought it was a very good game for Gregor, and also a good game for Nico Sturm. When it comes to Zetterlund, who filled in on that third line, Zetterlund was inconsistent, I would say. I think he had like 2 or 3 really, really good shifts. There was one shift in particular for sure in the offensive zone where he was just all over the puck. However, like I said, inconsistent. Besides those few shifts, he was definitely a bit more not noticeable. So it's still nice to see him in that bottom six, and you can see that David Quinn is putting him in that fourth line here tonight because he hasn't necessarily done a lot on the top six, but we'll see exactly where this ends up going. And then when it comes to the final two players on this in the roster, because I've already talked about Zetterlund, that is, of course, Lindblom and Lorenz continuing to be in the lineup. Not necessarily the best of games. Obviously, they kind of were in a situation where they were just sort of getting double shifted at times. We saw like LeBanc take shifts with these two players, and so they never really got anything rolling and were pretty ineffective. When it comes to the defensive pairings, we also saw David Quinn make many changes near the end of that Blue Jackets game, and those changes ended up very much sticking here tonight. Karlsson paired with Derek Pouliot, Vlasic paired with Nikolai Knyzhov, as well as Benning and Ferraro on that third pairing. Now, in the previous game against Columbus, I heavily praised Derek Pouliot in playing with Erik Karlsson. I was saying that might end up being a pretty good match. Here tonight, I thought Pouliot had a good start to this game, but there were definitely a couple of major mistakes, especially in the third period. He was very far forward on this Bjorkstrand goal, was not expecting the long stretch pass that came from Jan Igor that allowed Bjorkstrand to get this breakaway goal. And then there was also opportunity a few minutes later where again Pouliot aggressively pinching in the offensive zone gets heavily punished for it, and this time the Seattle Kraken do not manage to get the goal, but they came very close with a great chance. And so Pouliot, I had mentioned in the previous game and actually in the previous couple of reviews that I liked him and that he was offensively inclined but not super risky. Those were a couple of risky plays that he did make that he did get punished on, so we'll see exactly what happens and if there's some sort of talking to that goes, because when you are playing with Erik Karlsson, you can't necessarily afford to make those unless you are 100% sure. When it comes to the rest of the defense, I thought Knyzhov had a pretty effective game here. Not amazing, not anything outstanding, but for a defensive defenseman, certainly decently solid. And I thought the third pairing was okay for sure. Ferraro, an okay game, I guess, which is definitely better than many of the other games he has put up this season. And then when it comes to the goaltender, I already mentioned earlier on that the Sharks got significantly improved goaltending in this game compared to the previous one against the Blue Jackets, but of course there was that really tough goal for the game winner from Vince Dunn that Reimer would definitely like to have back. But if we sort of ignore that and we just look at the 60 minutes that the Sharks played in regulation, Reimer made a lot of very nice saves, so it was a good game for him for sure. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday where they will take on the New York Islanders, so playing against an Eastern Conference team, and we'll see where the Sharks go in these last 13 games of the season. Class dismissed.